The owner of a restaurant invited a homeless man to eat for free at his establishment. The next day, he was surprised to see the same homeless man standing in front of the restaurant inside a luxury car. The wind carried a biting chill through the narrow streets of Boston that afternoon, the kind that slipped under collars and nestled into bones. Jacob Miller stood outside his restaurant, Miller's table, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets as he scanned the sidewalk. Business had been steady that day, but as always he took a few minutes in the late afternoon to step outside and breathe in the city he loved. His restaurant, tucked between a bookstore and an old tailor's shop, had been his dream for years, serving home-style meals in a place that felt like an extension of his own kitchen. He was about to turn back inside when something caught his eye, a figure hunched near the dumpsters in the alley beside the building. Jacob paused. It wasn't uncommon to see people pass through the alley, sometimes digging through trash for cans or discarded food. But this man wasn't moving. He sat still, arms wrapped tightly around his body, his coat thin and worn. His face was partly hidden beneath a hood, but Jacob could see the grey stubble on his chin and the trembling in his fingers. Without thinking, twice Jacob stepped off the curb and walked toward him. "Hey," he said gently, crouching a few feet away so he wouldn't startle him. "You all right?" The man looked up slowly, eyes wary but not aggressive. There was something there. Something alert, something aware. He didn't answer, only nodded faintly as if the energy required to speak was too much. "You hungry?" Jacob asked. That word seemed to cut through the cold. The man blinked, hesitated, then gave another slow nod. "Come on in. I'll get you something warm." Jacob stood, waited for the man to gather himself, then led him into the restaurant. It wasn't busy at that hour, just a couple finishing up coffee and a server wiping down a counter. No one stared, though they noticed. Jacob guided the man to a table near the back, away from the draft of the front door. "Give me a minute," Jacob said, and headed into the kitchen. He returned with a bowl of steaming beef stew, thick with carrots and potatoes, and a slice of cornbread still warm from the oven. He placed a glass of water beside it, then sat across from the man without saying anything more. The man ate slowly at first, cautiously, but as the warmth of the food spread through him, his movements grew steadier, less frantic. He still didn't speak, but Jacob noticed the way he held his spoon, with a practiced elegance, a kind of grace that didn't match his appearance. He chewed with care. He didn't wolf down the meal like someone starved beyond reason, but instead with patience, like someone savoring something long forgotten. After a while, Jacob asked, "What's your name?" The man looked up. His eyes were sharp, grey-blue, intense, filled with something unreadable. He hesitated again, then shook his head slightly. "Don't matter," he said in a hoarse voice. Jacob didn't press. "All right," he said. "You need anything else?" The man stared at him for a long time before answering. "No, this is more than enough." There was a pause. The air between them seemed to shift, not uncomfortable, but full. Jacob didn't know what to say, and maybe that was fine. Sometimes silence was a kind of understanding. When the man finished, he pushed the empty bowl aside and sat back. He looked around the restaurant, the warm lighting, the soft hum of conversation, the smell of food still lingering from the dinner rush. "Thank you," he said. His voice cracked on the words. "Thank you for treating me like a person." Jacob's throat tightened slightly. "You are a person," he replied simply. The man stood. "You'd be surprised how often that's forgotten." He turned to leave, and Jacob didn't stop him. He watched as the man walked back out into the cold, his steps a little steadier than before. Later that night, as Jacob cleaned up and locked the doors, that one sentence echoed in his mind. "Thank you for treating me like a person." He thought about how easy it had been to offer a meal, how little effort it took, and yet how deeply it had seemed to matter. It wasn't charity, it was decency. And yet, the way the man had said it, with such raw sincerity, made Jacob realize how rare that decency might feel to someone in his position. Jacob didn't expect to see the man again. People came and went. He had offered food to others before, some returned, some didn't. It was never about what came after. It was about that one moment, that one chance to make someone feel seen. But even as he wiped down the last table and turned off the lights, something about the man lingered. His eyes, his voice, the strange composure beneath the exhaustion. Jacob went to bed that night thinking of the cold and the people still out in it. He thought of the man with no name and hoped, just hoped, that the warmth of that stew had done more than fill his stomach. He had no idea what the morning would bring. The next morning came with a sluggish grey sky, the kind that felt like it would never quite wake up. Jacob Miller arrived at Miller's table earlier than usual, unlocking the front door while the city still yawned and stirred. The air was crisper than the day before, the kind of cold that turned fingertips numb. Within minutes, he switched on the lights inside the restaurant, letting the warm yellow glow spill across polished wooden tables and neatly arranged chairs. As the heater clicked on, humming softly to life, he walked toward the back to start brewing the first pot of coffee, still thinking about the man from the night before. That face had embedded itself in his mind in a way he couldn't quite explain. Jacob had served countless meals to strangers over the years, some down on their luck, others just passing through. But there was something about that man's presence that Jacob couldn't shake. Maybe it was the way he ate, calm and deliberate, or how his eyes avoided Jacob's, not from shame but from something else entirely, like he was hiding in plain sight. Or maybe it was the final words he'd spoken, heavy and haunting. "Thank you for treating me like a person." That phrase hadn't just lingered, it had latched onto something deep in Jacob's chest, as though it had been waiting there for years to be heard. He was wiping down the counter when his employee Jenna came in, stamping her feet and rubbing her gloved hands together. "Freezing out there," she said, tossing her coat onto the hook near the kitchen entrance. "Want me to prep the pastries?" Jacob nodded, still lost in thought. She noticed. "You good?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about something from yesterday." He didn't explain. How could he? It felt strange to confess that a brief encounter with a nameless man had carved out such a space in his thoughts. A couple of regulars wandered in as the morning wore on, ordering their usual breakfasts, catching up on the latest headlines from the newspaper stand across the street. Everything moved as it always did, quiet, predictable, familiar. But for Jacob, the rhythm felt different, like something was about to change, though he had no idea what or why. Around 10 o'clock, after the morning rush had thinned, Jacob stepped outside to catch a breath of air. That's when he saw it. Parked directly across the street, just behind a parking meter that hadn't yet been fed, was a sleek black Cadillac. It looked pristine, polished, shining against the overcast sky like a mirror turned to midnight. The windows were tinted, but even from where he stood, Jacob could make out the figure leaning casually against the front of the car. It was him, the man from the alley. Only now he didn't look anything like he had yesterday. The grime and desperation were gone. His clothes were different, not just clean but tailored. A deep navy overcoat, fitted slacks, polished shoes. He wasn't just clean-shaven, he was composed. His hair was slicked back neatly, his posture upright. He stood like a man who belonged in boardrooms, not back alleys. Jacob stared, unable to move. For a brief moment, he wondered if he was mistaken. Maybe it wasn't the same man. But then, the stranger looked up and their eyes met across the street. And Jacob knew beyond doubt it was him. A surge of confusion rolled through him, followed by a flicker of something else, unease. The man didn't smile, didn't wave. He simply gave a small nod and started walking across the street. His movements were smooth, confident. He reached the sidewalk and stood just in front of Jacob. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, assured, completely different from the scratchy whisper of the night before. Jacob stared, too stunned to reply right away. "May I come in again?" the man asked. Jacob blinked. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. The man walked into Miller's table like he'd been there 100 times before. He chose the same table in the back and sat down, removing his coat with a precise motion and draping it over the chair. Jacob followed slowly, his mind racing, questions piling up with no answers in sight. He gestured toward Jenna behind the counter, signaling that he'd handle this table himself. She raised an eyebrow but nodded, clearly curious. Jacob brought over 2 cups of coffee and sat across from the man again. This time the man met his eyes. "You look different," Jacob said finally. "I feel different," the man replied. He took a sip of coffee, savoring it. "You have good taste in beans." Jacob leaned forward slightly, still watching him. "So, who are you?" The man smiled faintly, but it wasn't smug or evasive. It was tired, like someone used to being asked that question and never quite knowing how to answer. "Let's just say I've been many people. But today I'm Raymond. Raymond Carter." Jacob repeated the name in his head. It sounded ordinary, but the man in front of him was anything but. "You said yesterday you had nowhere to go," Jacob said. "Now you pull up in a Cadillac wearing a $1,000 coat. Forgive me if I'm confused." Raymond nodded. "Understandable, but I wasn't lying. Yesterday I had nowhere to go. Today, things are different." "That's a fast change." Raymond looked down at his cup, then back up at Jacob. "Sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one person doing something kind without expecting anything in return." Jacob didn't reply right away. He wasn't sure what to make of any of this. The man across from him spoke with the calmness of someone used to being in control. There was no trace of desperation in him now, only steadiness. It didn't feel like an act, but it didn't make any sense either. "Why come back, Jacoby?" asked quietly. Raymond's expression softened. "Because I wanted to see the place again, to remember what it felt like to be treated like a person when I wasn't sure I was one anymore." Jacob was silent. There was a sincerity in Raymond's voice that couldn't be faked. But still, who was he really? "I can't stay long," Raymond added. "I have some things to take care of, but I'll be back." And with that, he stood, pulled his coat back on, and slipped a small black business card onto the table before walking out. Jacob picked it up after the door shut behind him. There was no company logo, no job title, just a name, Raymond Carter, and a phone number. Jacob stared at it for a long time, the warmth of the coffee cooling in his hands. Something big had just entered his life, something unexpected, something that didn't follow the rules of logic he'd come to trust, and somewhere deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The following morning began like any other, with Jacob Miller arriving early to prepare for the day ahead. The streets of Boston were still quiet, brushed with the subtle hush that only early risers knew. A light frost had settled on the sidewalks and rooftops, glittering under the pale morning light. As he unlocked the door to Miller's table and stepped inside, the air was still, the restaurant dark and cold. He switched on the lights, illuminating the space with its familiar amber glow. The comforting scent of wood polish and lingering. Spices from yesterday's meals hung in the air. Everything appeared as it should be. Chairs aligned perfectly, counters spotless, menus stacked neatly by the register. Yet, as he moved through the motions, turning on the heaters, setting water to boil, checking the bakery delivery that had just arrived, Jacob felt a strange tension building in his chest. It wasn't anxiety exactly, nor was it fear. It was anticipation sharpened by uncertainty. The man from the day before, Raymond Carter, had left behind more than a business card. He had left behind 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. Jacob had barely slept the night before. He had turned Raymond's name over in his mind, repeating it like a mantra, wondering what it meant and how it fit into this sudden mystery. The transformation he'd witnessed, from a weathered, weary man scrounging warmth by a dumpster to a poised, articulate figure leaning against a luxury car, defied every rule of logic Jacob had come to trust. Nothing about it made sense, and yet there it was. He tried to focus on the routine. That was always his anchor when life got too loud. He prepped the day's specials, arranged the pastries behind the glass, and began brewing the first pot of fresh coffee. Still, his eyes drifted constantly to the front window, half expecting to see that black Cadillac again, half hoping not to. The clock struck 8 o'clock, then 8:30. Regulars trickled in. Mr. Langston, who always ordered oatmeal, with blueberries and a side of burnt toast, the Reyes couple, who shared pancakes and argued softly about crossword clues. Jacob greeted them all with his usual smile, took orders, checked on tables, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Just after 9 o'clock, as he stepped out front for a breath of cold air, he saw it, parked across the street in the exact same spot. As the day before, the black Cadillac waited, gleaming like obsidian. The windows were opaque, revealing nothing. Jacob's breath caught, forming a small cloud in the air. He stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and something like dread. The driver's door opened slowly, and once again Raymond Carter emerged, not rushed, not theatrical, simply composed. He wore a charcoal suit this time, sharp and fitted, paired with a grey scarf and black leather gloves. He looked like a man who had stepped out of a boardroom meeting, and not, as Jacob remembered vividly, from the shadows of a filthy alley. Raymond paused for a second by the curb, then crossed the street with measured steps. As he reached the sidewalk, he met Jacob's gaze with a quiet nod. "Morning," he said. Jacob swallowed, unsure how to respond. "You came back." "I said I would." Without another word, Raymond entered the restaurant. Jacob followed, glancing back at the car before stepping inside. Jenna, once again manning the register, raised her eyebrows at the sharply dressed man moving toward the back table with unshakable confidence. She shot Jacob a questioning look, but he only shook his head slightly and followed Raymond to the booth. They sat across from one another, and for a moment neither spoke. The hum of the restaurant filled the space between them, the clink of cutlery, the quiet murmur of conversation, the soft hiss of the espresso machine in the background. "You're making a habit of this," Jacob finally said. Raymond smiled, faintly. "It's a good place, warm, honest." "I still don't understand what this is," Jacob said, more candid now, less cautious. "Yesterday, you were one person. Today, you're another." "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not playing a game," Raymond interrupted, his voice calm. "I didn't come here to confuse you. I came back because something changed." Jacob leaned forward. "Changed how?" Raymond looked down at the table for a moment, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "I've been trying to find a reason to come back to myself," he said softly. "To come back to the world. Yesterday, you gave me that reason." Jacob didn't reply right away. He wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the explanation for what it was. But the leap was too wide, the gaps too many. "People don't go from homeless to driving luxury cars overnight," he said. "No," Raymond agreed, "they don't. But I wasn't as lost as I seemed. I had help. I had resources I'd turned my back on. Yesterday, after I left here, I decided to pick up the phone. And the people I once walked away from, they answered." That hung in the air, suspended like dust in a beam of light. "You just decided?" Jacob asked. "Yes, and it was because you reminded me of something. I forgot. What it means to be seen, what it means to matter." Jacob leaned back slightly, arms crossed. His instincts told him that Raymond was telling the truth, or at least some version of it. But his mind still fought the logic, still demanded more. "Who are you really?" he asked. Raymond's eyes locked onto his. "Someone who made mistakes. Someone who disappeared when things got too dark. And someone who, thanks to you, might be ready to step back into the light." The sincerity in his voice wasn't rehearsed. There was no sales pitch, no polished speech, just a man who seemed to be both grateful and haunted. Jacob didn't press further, not yet. He needed time to think, to digest. But one thing was certain. This man, whoever he truly was, had returned not just for another meal, but for something deeper. And whatever had started as a simple act of kindness was now unraveling into something much larger. As Raymond stood to leave, he looked back at Jacob and said, "I'll be in touch soon." Then he was gone again, slipping into the Cadillac and pulling away, leaving behind a whirlwind of questions and a silence that felt louder than anything Jacob had ever heard. Jacob Miller wasn't the kind of man who trusted easily. Years running a restaurant had taught him that appearances could be deceiving, and while he had never considered himself a skeptic, he had learned to be cautious with people who seemed too polished, too confident, too conveniently timed. Ever since Raymond Carter had reappeared in front of his restaurant in that immaculate Cadillac, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Jacob's entire monthly inventory, a strange tension had nested in his chest and refused to leave. He tried to shake it, tried to convince himself that it didn't matter who Raymond was or how he had managed to transform in 24 hours from a worn-out man living on the streets into someone who looked like a financial executive stepping out of a shareholder meeting. Maybe it wasn't his business. Maybe he should be content knowing he had helped someone when they needed it most, and that was the end of it. But the unease wouldn't fade. That evening, after closing the restaurant, Jacob sat alone in the back office. He stared at the small black business card Raymond had left on the table. No title, no company, just the name and the number. He ran his fingers over the edges, feeling the weight of it. Heavy cardstock, matte finish. It wasn't something you printed at a gas station kiosk. He considered calling the number. Just to ask questions, just to understand. But every time he reached for his phone, something held him back. Pride, perhaps, or fear that he would learn something he wasn't ready to know. The next morning, he arrived at Miller's table before sunrise. Jenna noticed immediately that he was distracted, quieter than usual. She asked if he was okay, and Jacob brushed it off, claiming he hadn't slept well. That wasn't entirely a lie. He had tossed and turned most of the night, mind racing with possibilities, questions, doubts. As the morning wore on, he kept glancing toward the door, half expecting Raymond to walk in again. But he didn't. Not that day and not the next. For a while, Jacob considered the possibility that he wouldn't return at all. Maybe the encounter had been a brief chapter, an anomaly, a collision of two very different lives at a very specific moment in time. But the absence didn't bring peace. It only deepened the sense that something unfinished was hanging between them, something unspoken. On the third day, just after the lunch rush had ended and the dining room had settled into a soft lull, Raymond returned. He entered quietly without fanfare, dressed again in a tailored coat and understated clothing that spoke of wealth without flaunting it. This time, he wasn't alone. A man followed him in, taller, lean, with a security-like posture and an earpiece that was barely visible beneath his hair. He remained by the door while Raymond walked to the same table in the back. Jacob approached with caution. There was something about the way Raymond carried himself that felt both familiar and foreign now. Not arrogant, but distant, controlled. "You've been busy," Jacob said as he reached the table. Raymond nodded. "I have." "Wasn't sure you were coming back." "I wasn't sure either," Raymond replied, folding his hands on the table. "But I said I would." Jacob remained standing. "And the guy at the door?" Raymond didn't look back. "Someone I need to keep around for now." Jacob frowned. "Why would someone like you need a bodyguard?" Raymond offered a small smile. "Because not everyone from my past was happy to see me reappear." That answer landed like a stone in Jacob's stomach. It didn't clarify anything. It only raised more questions. And the way Raymond had delivered it, calm, almost casual, sent a shiver down his spine. "Look," Jacob said, lowering his voice slightly. "I don't know what kind of life you've been living, but you're starting to show up here like this is some kind of safe house, and I run a restaurant, not a confessional. If there's something I need to know, something that could affect me or my staff, I want it straight." Raymond's expression didn't change. He took a slow breath, then looked Jacob directly in the eyes. "I understand your concern," he said, "and I respect it, but I'm not bringing danger here. I promise you that." Jacob didn't move. "Then tell me who you really are, because none of this makes sense." There was a long pause. Raymond seemed to consider the request seriously, as though measuring each possible outcome of what he might say next. Then he leaned slightly forward and said, "I will tell you, but not yet. There are things I need to sort out first. Things I'm not proud of, but I'm not hiding from you. I came here because you gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Kindness without judgment. I don't want to ruin that." Jacob studied him, searching his face for any hint of deception. But Raymond's eyes were clear, steady. Whatever he was hiding, he wasn't lying. Or at least, He wasn't lying to manipulate. Still, the weight of uncertainty gnawed at Jacob. He couldn't help it. It was in his nature to look past appearances, to question what didn't fit. "Why come here again?" Jacob asked. "You've clearly got money. You could be anywhere. Why this place?" Raymond looked around the restaurant for a moment, taking in the modest decor, the handwritten specials board, the warmth of the space. "Because this place feels real," he said. "Everything in my life got so complicated, so layered with false intentions and silent deals. But this," he gestured around, "this feels honest, and I needed to remember what that looked like." Jacob said nothing. He felt both flattered and suspicious. It wasn't every day that a man with a past shrouded in mystery claimed your small restaurant was his tether to reality. "I don't want to cause problems," Raymond added. "If you'd rather I stop coming, say the word." Jacob hesitated. Part of him wanted to say yes, to end the questions and return to the peace of routine. But another part, stronger, more curious, couldn't let go of the thread that had started unraveling the day he saw Raymond in that alley. "Just don't lie to me," Jacob said finally. "If you're going to keep coming back, I need the truth. When you're ready, whatever it is." Raymond nodded. "You have my word." Then, without another word, he stood, walked to the front, and exited the restaurant. His bodyguard followed, closely behind, and once again the Cadillac pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the stream of city traffic. Jacob watched them go, his reflection faint in the glass, and he knew one thing for certain. He had stepped into something far bigger than he ever expected, and the only way forward now was through. The next time Raymond Carter appeared at Miller's table, it was nearing the end of a long, rain-soaked Tuesday. The city had spent most of the day under a blanket of relentless drizzle, the streets gleaming with water, and the air filled with the constant patter of droplets on rooftops and sidewalks. Jacob had spent the afternoon in a state of quiet tension, his focus drifting during orders, his answers to customers shorter than usual. Even Jenna had picked up on it, casting him occasional glances that asked silent questions she didn't voice aloud. Jacob hadn't told her about the full scope of his unease. He hadn't said much to anyone. How could he explain the surreal unfolding of the past few days to someone who hadn't seen the shift firsthand? To her, Raymond was just another sharply dressed man who seemed out of place in their modest establishment. But to Jacob, he was a contradiction embodied, an enigma whose presence brought both intrigue and discomfort. The chime above the restaurant door rang just after 5 o'clock. The sound had become something Jacob responded to instinctively, a trigger tied to greeting regulars, new guests and delivery drivers. But when he looked up and saw Raymond standing in the doorway, coat damp with rain and hair slightly disheveled, it felt different. There was no bodyguard this time, no Cadillac parked visibly outside, just Raymond alone and looking more human than ever before. He approached the counter, meeting Jacob's eyes with a nod that carried more weight than words. Jacob returned the gesture and motioned toward the back, where their usual booth remained empty. Raymond took the seat without hesitation, and Jacob followed a moment later, 2 coffees in hand. "I won't stay long," Raymond said quietly, cupping the warm mug between his hands. "But I think it's time I told you a little more." Jacob said nothing, only sat down and waited. Raymond stared into his coffee for a few seconds before speaking again. "My name is real, Raymond Carter. I wasn't trying to hide it, but what I didn't tell you is where I came from, or more accurately, what I walked away from." The hum of the restaurant faded behind the wall of focus that built up between the two men. Even the quiet conversations of other customers seemed to mute under the weight of what Raymond was about to share. 10 years ago, he continued, I was one of the co-founders of a tech startup. We built predictive analytics software, early machine learning models before that became a buzzword. It started in a basement with 3 of us, working late, nights eating cheap takeout, dreaming big. Then the investors came, the buzz, the big contracts. In 5 years, we were valued at over $100 million. Jacob leaned back slightly, absorbing the scope of it. He'd heard stories like this before. Garage-built empires, fast money, young success. But hearing it from Raymond here in his booth felt surreal. We sold the company just over 3 years ago, Raymond continued. A strategic acquisition by a tech giant on the West Coast. I was supposed to retire young, start over, maybe build something new, but then came the betrayal. He paused, lifting the coffee to his lips, then setting it down again without drinking. One of my co-founders, someone I considered a brother, used our transition period to make a move against me. Legal manipulation, contract loopholes. Suddenly I was cut out of major equity disbursements, accused of breaching internal ethics agreements, and handed a lawsuit that bled me for nearly a year. Jacob frowned. "Why didn't you fight it?" "I did," Raymond said. "For a while. But it wasn't just the money. It was the humiliation. The media picked up the story, twisted it, painted me as the reckless genius who self-destructed, and I let it get to me. I stopped defending myself. I disappeared." "You just walked away?" Raymond nodded. "From everything. From the money. From my name, from the people who wanted answers. I didn't want pity, I didn't want questions, I just wanted silence. And eventually that silence became a kind of prison." Jacob felt the edge of something hard in his chest. He'd seen people fall before. Addiction, illness, broken relationships, but never like this. Never someone who had reached such heights, and then vanished so completely. "I've been off the grid for almost 2 years, Raymond said. Different cities. Sometimes I slept in shelters. Sometimes I didn't sleep at all. I had resources hidden, yes, accounts untouched, assets I never accessed, but I refused to use them. I felt like I didn't deserve to. And then you came here," Jacob said, more of a statement than a question. Raymond looked at him, his expression unreadable. "That night you gave me a meal without hesitation. It was the first time in a long while someone looked at me without judgment. Not because of who I used to be, not because of who I'd become. Just a man offering another man a seat at his table." Jacob felt the words settle into him like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Everything he had wondered about now had a shape, a context, even if it wasn't the full picture yet. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Raymond added. "I know this might all seem strange, sudden, but I needed to tell you part of the truth before I asked for anything more." Jacob narrowed his eyes slightly. "Are you planning to ask me for something?" "Not tonight," Raymond said. "But yes, soon." Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with thought, with meaning. Jacob realized he wasn't angry, not exactly. He was unsettled, yes, but more so by the emotion behind Raymond's confession than the facts themselves. There was something deeply honest in the way he spoke, something that made Jacob believe, even as doubt lingered on the edges. "I don't know what to make of all this," Jacob admitted. "I run a restaurant. I'm not used to this level of drama." Raymond chuckled, not unkindly. "Neither was I. But life doesn't really care about what we're used to, does it?" Jacob couldn't argue with that. Raymond stood, leaving a few bills on the table to cover the coffee, another small sign of his return to the world he had abandoned. "I'll be back," he said, "and next time I'll bring the rest of the story." As he walked out into the rain, no umbrella, just a quiet step into the evening, Jacob felt the weight of what had been shared. He wasn't sure what Raymond would ask of him next, but whatever it was, Jacob knew the simple gesture he had made days ago had unraveled into something far deeper, and there was no walking away from it now. For the first time in a long while, Jacob Miller found himself looking at his restaurant through unfamiliar eyes. Every table, every chair, every worn tile beneath his boots seemed to carry more weight than it had before. The simplicity of Miller's table, once a sanctuary of stability, now felt like a stage set for something far more complex than Jacob had ever prepared for. He had spent his life creating a space of warmth and routine, of community and good, food. But ever since Raymond Carter stepped through his doors for the second time, reality had begun to shift. It wasn't just the startling contrast between Raymond's ragged state during their first encounter and the controlled elegance he exhibited afterward. It wasn't even the story Raymond had begun to tell, a tale of wealth, betrayal, and isolation. It was something deeper, something Jacob couldn't quite name but felt pulsing beneath the surface every time Raymond appeared, a tension, an energy that didn't belong in a place like this. He found himself thinking about Raymond constantly. Not in the way one might think about a potential threat or a mysterious benefactor, but in a quieter, more personal way. He thought about the way Raymond had spoken during their last conversation, careful, deliberate, each word weighed and chosen. He thought about the pain behind his voice, about the quiet sorrow in his eyes when he had admitted to disappearing from the world. And yet, beneath that vulnerability, Jacob had seen strength, a calculated strength. That was the part that kept him up at night. Was Raymond truly someone rebuilding himself from ruin, or was he manipulating a narrative for some purpose yet unseen? Jacob hated that he even considered the possibility. He prided himself on believing in people, on giving them the benefit of the doubt. But something about this story, it moved too fast, shifted too cleanly, and left too many gaps untouched. The restaurant kept running, of course. Life didn't stop because one man's past had walked through the front door. Jenna continued managing the register, handling orders with her usual mix of charm and sarcasm. The kitchen crew prepped meals, argued over recipes, and told bad jokes as they worked through the lunch rush. Customers came and went, blissfully, unaware of the questions circling in Jacob's head, like birds over open water. But Jacob couldn't shake the growing sense that Raymond's reappearance was not the end of something. It was the beginning. A week passed with no sign of Raymond. No Cadillac outside. No quiet figure slipping through the door at dusk. No further explanation. Jacob didn't know if he was relieved or disappointed. Each day that passed added a layer of restlessness to his thoughts. He didn't talk about it, not with Jenna, not with anyone, but it lingered, growing heavier by the hour. Then, late one evening, just after closing, Jacob stepped out the back door to take out the trash. The alley was silent, dimly lit by the single flickering bulb mounted above the door. The cold air bit at his skin, sharp and indifferent. As he dropped the trash bags into the bin, he heard a sound, soft footsteps on wet pavement. He turned quickly, instincts suddenly alert. For a brief second, he felt a flash of unease, but then he saw who it was. Raymond stood just inside the mouth of the alley, coat collar up, hands in his pockets. He wasn't smiling. He looked tired, worn in a different way than before. "You've been gone a while," Jacob said, stepping forward, his voice more accusatory than he intended. "I needed time," Raymond replied, "to deal with some things, to make sure I wasn't bringing more trouble to your door." Jacob studied him under the weak light. There was something different now. Less polished, more raw. Raymond looked like someone who had been fighting battles behind closed doors. "You said you'd come back with the rest of the story," Jacob said, "but all I've got is silence." "I haven't forgotten," Raymond said. "I've just been cleaning up." "Cleaning up what?" Raymond hesitated. "My name, my finances, my past. Everything that could have come back to bite me if I didn't handle it properly." Jacob folded his arms. "I'm not asking for details, but I'm starting to wonder if I've let something dangerous walk through my door." Raymond's expression darkened slightly, not with anger, but with something more complex. Disappointment, maybe. Regret. "You think I'm dangerous?" "I think I don't know what to think," Jacob replied, "and that bothers me." Raymond took a slow breath. "I understand. But let me ask you something. Have I ever given you a reason not to trust me?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to admit how conflicted he felt. Raymond hadn't done anything wrong, not really, but that didn't erase the shadows that followed him. "You haven't lied," Jacob said finally, "but you've also told me just enough truth to keep me guessing." Raymond nodded, accepting the judgment without argument. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said quietly. "No more silence, no more fragments. I'll give you the whole picture." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night without another word. The next day, Jacob arrived at Miller's table earlier than usual. He couldn't sleep. His mind had been too busy processing the brief encounter in the alley. There was a part of him that wanted to lock the door and forget the whole thing. But another part, stronger, needed to know the truth. Not just for his own peace of mind, but because something in him believed, despite the confusion, despite the doubt, that this story mattered. Throughout the day, he found himself watching the clock more than the door. Jenna noticed. "Expecting someone?" she asked around lunchtime. "Maybe," Jacob replied. Raymond arrived just before sunset, alone again. No car in sight, no bodyguard. Just a man walking slowly down the sidewalk, his face unreadable. Jacob met him at the door, held it open and nodded toward the back table. "Sit," he said. "Talk." Raymond did as asked. He removed his coat, placed it neatly beside him, and took the seat like someone ready to face judgment. "I owe you a lot," he began, "and the least I can do is give you the full truth." Jacob sat across from him, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "Start talking." The hours following Raymond's promise of full transparency passed with an unbearable slowness. Jacob Miller tried to go about his usual tasks, checking inventory, finalizing next week's supply orders, overseeing the afternoon meal prep. But his focus was fractured. Everything around him seemed muted, out of sync. Even the familiar hum of Miller's table, the gentle clatter of dishes, the warmth of conversation between customers, the scent of rosemary and roasted garlic floating in from the kitchen, felt somehow distant. He kept returning to one thing, that moment in the alley, Raymond standing there like a ghost come back to claim his name. Jacob wasn't someone who normally sought out secrets. He was a man of habits, of structure, of honest work. But there was a tension inside him now, a low thrum of unease that refused to be ignored. The story Raymond had begun to tell him, of betrayal, of collapse, of a long exile from the life he'd built, was both compelling and suspicious. And Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was still being withheld. That night, long after the restaurant had closed and Jenna had gone home, Jacob sat alone in the office, staring at his computer. The black business card Raymond had left on the table rested beside the keyboard. He picked it up again, ran his thumb along the edge, and placed it back down with a sigh. Then, reluctantly, he opened his browser and typed in the name. Raymond Carter. What he found didn't surprise him. Not at first. There were old articles, some dating back 5 to 6 years, mentioning a Raymond Carter in connection with a Boston-based tech company called Adventech Systems. The articles painted the picture of a young, ambitious software engineer turned entrepreneur. He was quoted in several startup profiles, photographed at industry events, and occasionally interviewed by niche tech blogs. His name appeared alongside 2 other co-founders, Isaac Brenner and Melissa Rames. The 3 were described as a visionary trio, hailed for their disruptive approach to predictive algorithms in digital logistics. Jacob kept reading. The early praise eventually gave way to tension. A headline from 3 years ago read, "Adventech co-founder ousted amidst ethics probe." The article was vague but pointed. It claimed that internal audits had revealed discrepancies in project data, unauthorized use of proprietary models, and a breach of confidentiality clauses. Raymond Carter's name was central in all allegations. Jacob read every word twice. Then 3 times. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. The story presented Raymond as either a reckless innovator who had crossed ethical lines or a scapegoat for decisions made by others behind closed doors. Several articles mentioned a lawsuit filed by Brenner and Rames, but most were light on details, referencing sealed documents and ongoing litigation. Still, one thing became clear: Raymond hadn't lied about what had happened to him. At least, not entirely. What unsettled Jacob wasn't the confirmation of Raymond's fall. It was how little there was afterward. No follow-up pieces, no statements, no legal outcomes. It was as if Raymond had vanished off the grid entirely. No social media, no public appearances, no new ventures, nothing. He minimized the browser and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The pieces were there, but they didn't quite fit. How does someone with that much visibility just disappear? And how does that same person re-emerge within days, looking clean, wealthy, and composed? The next morning, Jacob felt a strange sense of clarity. He decided to ask around, discreetly. Not because he wanted to catch Raymond in a lie, but because he needed to understand what was coming through his door. He started with a few phone calls. An old college friend who worked in IT consulting, a cousin involved in early-stage tech investments, a vendor who once mentioned having clients in the startup scene. The name Raymond Carter sparked recognition in every case. Some remembered the innovation, others remembered the scandal. A few repeated rumors Jacob had already seen in print, phrases like overreached, burned too fast, and disappeared overnight. One of them, however, said something that made Jacob pause. He was brilliant, the man said over the phone, but paranoid, always convinced someone was going to pull the rug out from under him. Guess he wasn't wrong. You say he's back? In Boston? Yeah, Jacob replied cautiously. Just curious. The man on the other end was quiet for a beat. If he's reappeared, he's either planning something or trying to close a chapter. Either way, I wouldn't get too comfortable. Raymond never did anything halfway. Jacob ended the call with a tight grip on the receiver. That afternoon, when Raymond arrived again, Jacob was waiting for him, not at the usual booth, but near the entrance. He greeted him calmly, gestured toward the back, and brought 2 fresh cups of coffee as always. But this time there was no preamble, no hesitation. I looked you up, Jacob said, sitting down across from him. Raymond didn't flinch. I figured you might. I read everything I could find. I know about Adventech, the articles, the ethics probe, the lawsuit. Raymond nodded slowly. And? I want to know your version, the one that doesn't end in headlines. Raymond sat back, his expression unreadable. He took a sip of coffee before answering. I wasn't innocent, he said. But I wasn't guilty in the way they made it seem, either. I built a system, an adaptive algorithm, with machine learning capabilities well ahead of its time. It worked, but it was messy, incomplete. My partners wanted to roll it out to secure more funding. I said it wasn't ready. They overruled me, so I copied the base code to continue refining it privately. They called it theft. They called it a breach, and they used that to erase me. You didn't fight back? Raymond's jaw tightened. I tried. But when you're outnumbered, outfunded, and your name's already been dragged through the mud, sometimes the fight isn't worth what it costs. Jacob absorbed the explanation silently. It had the ring of truth, though truth, he knew, often wore many faces. Why come here, he asked finally. Of all places, why my restaurant? Raymond looked around again, just as he had the first time. Because it felt like the first honest space I'd been in for years. Because when I had nothing, you didn't look at me like I was nothing. And because I need something I never thought I'd ask for again. What's that? A second chance, Raymond said. Not just at business. At being human. Jacob didn't respond right away. There was nothing simple about what he was being asked to understand. But as he looked at Raymond, the man who had arrived hungry and broken, then returned guarded and composed, he saw someone, not just trying to reclaim his past, but someone fighting to rebuild something entirely new. That didn't erase the doubt. But it made room for something else. Possibility. The air in the restaurant felt heavier than usual the next day, as if the weight of Jacob's questions had soaked into the very walls of Miller's table. Though the morning began as any other, doors unlocked at 7 o'clock, lights humming to life. The smell of coffee slowly replacing the stale scent of overnight silence. Jacob couldn't keep his mind from spinning. The confrontation with Raymond the day before had left more questions than answers, even after hours of scouring the man's past online and collecting fragments of truth. The narrative was becoming too complex for passive observation. Something had to shift, and Jacob knew that the shift had to come from him. By mid-morning he had made his decision. The subtle deference he had shown Raymond up to that point, the hesitation, the polite distance, the willingness to wait for the truth to unfold at someone else's pace, was over. If Raymond wanted to keep showing up at Miller's table, if he wanted to share coffee and trade in half-stories, he would now have to answer for the tension he carried with him. Raymond arrived just after 10 o'clock, as Jacob had somehow expected. It was as if the man had an internal clock synced to Jacob's nerves. He came alone again. No entourage, no vehicle visible through the windows. He wore a dark wool coat and carried himself with that same frustrating calm that seemed impervious to confrontation. He approached their usual table, but Jacob stopped him near the counter. Not today, Jacob said. gesturing toward a smaller table tucked near the front, away from the safety of their familiar booth. Raymond tilted his head slightly, but said nothing. He followed Jacob to the new table, took off his coat, and sat down across from him without protest. Jacob brought the coffee without being asked, setting both cups down before taking his own seat. He didn't bother with pleasantries. The moment his hands were free, he leaned forward and fixed Raymond with a direct, unwavering stare. "Who are you really?" Raymond didn't blink. "I told you—" "No," Jacob interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "You told me pieces. Enough to make me think I was getting the truth, but not enough to know what you're doing here or what you want. I've let this go on too long without answers. So this is me asking, clearly and directly, what to? Is this? What are you doing here? What are you hiding?" Raymond looked down at the table for a moment, his fingers wrapped around the coffee cup. When he looked up again, there was something different in his expression. Not surprise, not anger, but something close to resignation. "I'm not hiding anything that would hurt you," he said. "I swear that." "That's not what I asked," Jacob replied. Raymond sighed, a long, quiet breath that seemed to draw something deeper from him. "I came back to this city with a purpose," he said slowly. "At first it was just to see what was left of the life I abandoned, the places I used to walk, the streets I once drove through without noticing. I didn't plan on stopping here. But when I saw you in that alley, when I saw how you looked at me, how you offered that meal without flinching, it shifted something." Jacob didn't soften. "That's not a purpose, that's a sentiment." Raymond nodded. "Fair enough, then here's the rest. I have resources, not all of them public, not all of them entirely clean. After I disappeared, I made arrangements. Off the books, assets, silent accounts, fallback structures, legal but obscured. They were my way out, my contingency plan. I activated them recently to rebuild, not just myself, but something better, something I could control, fully and honestly this time." Jacob's jaw clenched. "Why here?" "Because I wanted to start from a place where I wasn't defined by what I used to be, where I could test whether I still had something decent left to offer. And this place, your restaurant, gave me a glimpse of that possibility." Jacob leaned back slightly, absorbing the words. "So what? You want to turn this place into your redemption project?" Raymond shook his head. "Not yours. Ours." Jacob blinked. "What?" Raymond met his gaze evenly. "I want to offer you a partnership. Not in name only, an actual stake. I invest in Miller's Table. We expand. Not just in size, but in mission. We use it as a model for something bigger. Social reintegration through food and community. Meals for those in need. Training programs. Second chances." Jacob stared at him, stunned. "Why would you think I'd want that?" "Because you've already been doing it in small ways. You helped me. You've helped others. You care about more than profit. And because, whether you realize it or not, this place is already more than a restaurant." Jacob's mouth was dry. He took a sip of coffee to cover his hesitation, but the heat of the drink only intensified the heat in his chest. Part of him was furious, at the arrogance, at the assumption that he would be interested in some grand plan he never asked for. But another part, deeper and quieter, felt seen, understood. "This is a lot to process," he said finally. "And I'm not sure I believe you, not fully." "I don't expect you to," Raymond said. "Not yet. That's why I'm being honest now. The full truth. No omissions." Jacob studied him. There was nothing in Raymond's face that suggested deceit. If anything, there was a quiet urgency, a kind of need that didn't come from manipulation, but from someone trying to find a place in a world they no longer understood. "And if I say no?" Jacob asked. Raymond shrugged. "Then I walk away. Grateful for what you gave me. No hard feelings." Jacob looked out the window for a long moment. The street was quiet. A few pedestrians passed, bundled in scarves and coats. The city moved on, unaware that a strange offer had just landed like a stone in the middle of his quiet life. "I'm not saying yes," Jacob said, finally turning back to him. "But I'm not saying no either. You want to build something real, then prove it with action, not just words." Raymond nodded. "That's all I'm asking for." The two men sat in silence for a while longer, each drinking slowly from their coffee cups, each silently adjusting to the new shape of the world between them. The cold returned to Boston that night, wrapping the city in its silent grip. Wind brushed through the narrow streets, carrying with it a hush that turned even the busiest intersections into spaces of muted tension. Inside Miller's table, the last of the dinner patrons had trickled out, leaving behind empty plates, half-finished conversations, and the soft clatter of dishes being washed in the back. Jacob lingered by the front windows longer than usual, watching the way streetlights reflected in the damp pavement. The conversation with Raymond earlier still clung to him like the frost in the air outside. Sharp, difficult to ignore, impossible to fully understand. The offer of partnership felt surreal, absurd even. Jacob had built Miller's table from the ground up with nothing but sweat, stubbornness, and years of taking chances on himself. The idea of sharing ownership, of merging his dream with someone else's vision, was almost offensive. And yet there was a small voice in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. The voice that remembered how he had looked at Raymond in that alley, how something unspoken had passed between them, something deeper than charity, recognition perhaps. The understanding of a man trying to start over, in a world that rarely forgave failure. He stayed at the restaurant well past closing time, wiping down already clean counters, refilling salt shakers that didn't need refilling. He didn't want to go home, not because he feared what waited there, just silence, and a bed that had grown too familiar, but because he didn't trust what would rise in him once the distractions were gone. Doubt was easier to manage when your hands were busy. It was nearly midnight when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. It wasn't Raymond's. For a moment, Jacob considered ignoring it, but something made him answer. Jacob Miller, speaking. "Good evening, Mr. Miller. My name is Erin Walters. I'm an attorney. I represent Raymond Carter." The voice was calm, professional, female, sharp but not cold. Jacob straightened instinctively. "Yes? I hope I'm not calling too late." "You are," Jacob said, "but go on." There was a brief pause on the line before she continued. "I'm reaching out because Mr. Carter has authorized me to discuss certain matters with you, specifically in regard to his proposal and the steps he's taking to ensure full transparency moving forward." Jacob paced slowly along the restaurant floor. "And what exactly does that mean?" "Raymond has established a legal trust through which he intends to fund a community initiative, what he described to you as a reintegration center built around your restaurant model. The documents have been drafted. I've been instructed to offer you full access to them for review, should you wish to verify his intentions." Jacob's breath caught. This wasn't just talk, not an idea thrown around in a moment of emotional clarity. This was real, real enough to involve lawyers, real enough to put his name in someone else's documentation. "I assume you have my contact information because of him." "Yes," Erin replied. "He gave it to me with your consent implied, following your last conversation. If that was an error, I'll terminate the discussion here." "No," Jacob said quickly. "Go on." "I'll email the documents to you tonight," she said. "You're under no obligation to respond, no signatures, no deadlines, but you deserve to know the scope of what's being proposed, and to see that it isn't just an idea, it's a structure." Jacob stopped pacing. His eyes moved to the booth where Raymond always sat. Empty now, but still marked by the presence of a man who had unsettled his world with nothing more than honesty. "What does he want from me?" "Gratitude," she said, "and partnership if you're willing." Her voice softened slightly. "But if you want my unprofessional opinion, I think Raymond Carter is looking for redemption, not just in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of someone who reminded him what decency looks like." Jacob didn't speak for several seconds. "I'll read the documents," he said finally. "I thought you might," she replied. "Good night, Mr. Miller." The line went dead. Jacob stood there for a long time staring at nothing, the glow of the city outside casting soft shadows across the floor. True to her word, the email arrived minutes later. The subject line was simple: Miller's Table Partnership Initiative. Attached were legal PDFs, detailed outlines of financial arrangements, proposed ownership divisions, zoning expansions, even charitable structures that would provide food and job training for the homeless population in the surrounding area. Everything was professional, clear, real. Jacob sat down at the bar, opened his laptop and began to read. Each page deepened the knot in his chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something closer to the terror of possibility. He was being handed the chance to change his life and others' lives with the help of a man he barely knew. A man who in the span of 2 weeks had gone from a face in the alley to a presence strong enough to reshape the very foundation of Jacob's world. By the time he reached the last page, the sky outside had begun to pale and his coffee had long gone cold. When he finally rose from the bar stool, he felt different, not certain, not resolved, but different. And that he knew meant something was already beginning to change. The following morning arrived not with clarity, but with a dull ache behind Jacob Miller's eyes. He had slept, but only barely, each hour punctuated by a return to the glowing screen of his laptop, by rereading passages of legal jargon he only half understood, and by imagining what it would mean to say yes to something so far outside the life he had built. He moved through his morning routine on autopilot, unlocking the door to Miller's table, flipping the lights, preparing coffee with the same mechanical precision that had marked his mornings for over a decade. But the stillness inside him had been disrupted, and there was no going back to the version of himself that had existed before Raymond Carter walked into his life. Jenna noticed the change the moment she stepped in. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, eyeing him over the rim of her travel mug. "Feels like it," Jacob muttered, wiping down the counter with a towel that didn't need to be used. "Busy night." "Doing what? Solving world hunger?" "Something like that." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. They had worked together long enough for her to know when he wasn't ready to talk. By mid-morning, the buzz of the breakfast crowd had begun to taper off. The restaurant settled into its late morning lull, that strange in-between hour when only freelancers, retirees, and the occasional drifter wandered through. Jacob stood behind the counter, scanning inventory notes on his tablet, when the door opened and Raymond stepped in. No coat this time, no tailored suit, just a simple sweater, dark jeans, and worn boots. He looked like any other man walking in off the street, but Jacob knew better. Raymond met his eyes, nodded once, and made his way to the usual booth. Jacob waited a full minute before joining him. They sat in silence as Jenna brought over 2 cups of coffee, her gaze flicking curiously between them before she walked back to the kitchen. Neither man touched his drink right away. Jacob spoke first. "I got a call from your lawyer." "I asked her to reach out," Raymond said without hesitation. "I didn't want it to feel like I was cornering you." "You weren't," Jacob replied, "but I read the documents, all of them." Raymond's expression didn't change, but Jacob noticed the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. "And?" he asked. Jacob exhaled. "It's a lot. More than I expected. It's not just a business proposal. It's a whole system, structure, funding, planning. You've been working on this longer than I thought." "Almost 6 months," Raymond said. "Even before I walked into this place, I was trying to figure out how to come back into the world without repeating my mistakes. This idea of a place that serves more than food, that offers purpose instead of pity, it kept me going." Jacob looked down at the table, fingers tapping absently against the ceramic edge of his cup. "You don't think you're rushing into this?" he asked. "I mean, you were sleeping in an alley 2 weeks ago." Raymond smiled faintly. "You think that makes me unqualified to rebuild?" "No," Jacob replied, "but it makes me wonder if this is about the people you're trying to help, or the man you're trying to be." "That's fair," Raymond said, "and the truth is it's both. I can't separate them, I don't want to. I spent years pretending my ideas were enough. But ideas without people, without responsibility, without roots, they collapse. You showed me what it looks like when someone stands still long enough to matter. I want to build something that matters too." Jacob took a long sip of coffee, considering everything he'd heard, everything he'd read, everything that had changed in such a short span of time. He wasn't a man who chased ambition. His dreams had always been quieter, consistency, stability, something real. He had never expected to be asked to think bigger. "And why me?" he asked. "You could have picked anyone with a name, a reputation, a background in outreach or nonprofit development. Why come to a guy running a neighborhood diner?" Raymond leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "Because you saw me when I was invisible," he said. "Because you treated me like I mattered when I couldn't even look at myself. And because this place, your place, has heart. I've been to 100 restaurants in my life, some with Michelin stars, some in back alleys in cities I don't even remember. But Miller's Table feels like home, and I think that's where change has to start, at home." Jacob said nothing. There were no arguments left to make, no suspicions that hadn't already been laid bare. He looked at Raymond not as the man he had met in the alley or the polished figure who drove a Cadillac, but as someone who had returned to the world with empty hands and was trying in his own fractured way to offer something back. "What exactly would you want from me?" Jacob asked finally. "What would this partnership look like?" Raymond didn't hesitate. "You keep doing what you do. You run the kitchen. You run the floor. You keep the heart of the place intact. I'll provide the infrastructure to expand. Second location, outreach staff, volunteer programs, legal groundwork for community partnerships. I want to invest in the future of this place, but not at the cost of what it is now. You keep control, you keep your name. I don't want to own Miller's Table. I want to build something beside it." The simplicity of the offer hit Jacob harder than any elaborate business plan could have. It wasn't a takeover, it wasn't charity. It was, in its purest form, an extension of the same gesture Jacob had made weeks ago, offering someone a seat at the table, no strings attached. "I need time," Jacob said. "You've got it," Raymond replied. They finished their coffee in silence, no handshakes, no promises, just a quiet agreement between two men who, in different ways, were trying to rebuild their lives by building something for others. And though Jacob didn't say it out loud, a part of him already knew this was the beginning of something much larger than either of them had planned. The air in Miller's Table had begun to change, not just in temperature or scent, but in tone. The regulars sensed it first, not with suspicion, but with that quiet awareness shared by those who return day after day, who notice when chairs are shifted slightly, when the music is softer, when the energy behind the counter moves with a different rhythm. Jacob had not spoken openly about Raymond Carter's proposal, nor had he made any visible changes yet. But something about him had shifted. His eyes held more weight, his movements more intention, the unspoken presence of a decision hovering on the edge of action. It was 3 days after the last meeting with Raymond when the truth arrived fully formed, not in bits or measured phrases, but in a confession that neither expected nor resisted. Raymond had called earlier in the morning, asking to meet outside of the restaurant. Jacob hesitated at first, his instincts naturally tethered to the familiar space of Miller's Table, but something in Raymond's voice told him it was necessary. They agreed on a small park near the river, quiet and tucked between office buildings. It was a place where the city breathed differently, where the sound of moving water muted the constant hum of engines and conversation. Raymond was already there when Jacob arrived. He stood near a bench, coat unbuttoned, hands deep in his pockets. He looked neither polished nor broken, just human, caught between two versions of himself. Jacob approached without a word and sat. The river moved beside them, slow and steady, reflecting the pale sky and silver ripples. "I need to tell you the rest," Raymond said after a moment. "All of it. I don't want you to hear it from someone else, and I don't want there to be a single piece of doubt between us if we're going to build anything real." Jacob nodded. "Go ahead." Raymond's eyes didn't meet his at first. He stared at the water as he spoke. "My story doesn't start with Adventech. It ends there. What you read, the articles, the scandal, the disappearance, that's all public knowledge. What's not public is how far I fell after the spotlight moved on. I spent almost a year living out of hotel rooms, running on money that didn't feel like mine anymore. The lawsuit stripped me of most of my equity, but I had hidden assets. Trust my father helped me build back when I thought I understood how the world worked. When I stopped fighting, I went silent. Not out of shame, but because I didn't know how to be anyone without my name attached to something. Jacob listened. Without interruption, his body still, eyes fixed on the river, as if it were a mirror reflecting the weight of Raymond's words. I moved west, changed cities every month, lost track of time. At one point, I let my ID expire on purpose. It was easier not to exist. No expectations, no questions. I wasn't trying to punish myself, I just didn't believe I had anything left to offer, until I didn't even try to hide it anymore. The clothes got dirtier, the shelters grew colder, and eventually I stopped talking to people altogether. He paused, then turned to look at Jacob directly, and then I found myself in that alley beside your restaurant. I hadn't eaten a full meal in days. I wasn't planning to ask anyone for help, I was just trying to stay warm. But you saw me, and you didn't flinch. Jacob finally spoke, his voice quiet. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I was just feeding someone who needed food. I know, Raymond said, and that's why it worked, because you didn't expect anything from me. You didn't ask questions. You didn't hand me a pamphlet or lecture me about choices. You gave me food, a chair, and the dignity of silence. And when I walked out of that door, I realized that I wasn't done, that maybe I had one more chance left if I could find the right place to start again. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Jacob. It was a letter, handwritten, dense with ink and emotion. It wasn't addressed to Jacob, but to Raymond's parents, apologizing for the silence, for the shame, for the failure. He never let them see. Jacob scanned it briefly, then folded it carefully and handed it back. You wrote this after we met? Raymond nodded. That night. It was the first thing I'd written in months. I didn't send it. They passed away. During my silence, my father 2 years ago, my mother last spring, they never knew what happened. They just thought I'd gone abroad. Jacob absorbed the weight of that. Grief has strange timing, he said. Raymond looked back at the water. I thought I had buried everything I was, but you made me want to dig it up again, and now here I am asking to plant something new. There was no drama in his voice, no plea, just clarity. Jacob leaned back, letting the silence stretch between them. Then, finally, he asked, and the money? The Cadillac? The lawyer? All of that came from those hidden accounts? Yes, Raymond said. I liquidated what was left, sold off the properties I still had stakes in, paid off every outstanding debt, including personal ones. I'm clean now, legally, financially, emotionally. That's another matter, but I'm trying. Jacob nodded. Why tell me all this now? Because if I'm going to build something beside you, I can't do it from a lie, not even a small one. You need to know who I am, who I was, and what I'm still becoming. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the river, the wind tugging gently at the branches above. I still don't know if I can say yes, Jacob admitted, not because I don't believe you, but because this place, my restaurant, it's the only thing I've built without compromise. I don't know if I'm ready to share that with someone, even for the right reasons. I won't push, Raymond said. Whatever you decide, I'm grateful for what you gave me. A reason to wake up again. They stood slowly, neither offering a handshake nor parting words. The silence between them wasn't emptiness. It was a space being filled slowly, carefully, honestly. By the time Jacob returned to the restaurant that afternoon, he knew that nothing about the past few weeks would leave him unchanged. Whether or not he accepted Raymond's proposal, the act of hearing the full truth had already built something between them. Not just a possible business partnership, not just a shared vision, but something quieter, something rarer. Trust. The days that followed Raymond's confession passed with a quiet, pressing weight. Jacob Miller returned to his routines, but nothing about them felt routine anymore. He arrived early to Miller's table each morning, brewed the coffee, unlocked the front door and watched the sunlight bleed slowly across the floorboards. The place was the same smell of fresh bread in the air, same scratchy radio playing, old soul records in the background, but Jacob moved through it like someone standing on the edge of something irreversible. He reviewed the documents again. Each night, after the restaurant closed and the last dish was cleaned, he would sit at the bar with a glass of water, The paperwork spread out before him like a map of uncharted territory. The proposal was sound. The legal structures were tight. The financial backing was clear and unthreatening. But it wasn't the logistics that kept Jacob up at night. It was the fear of losing what Miller's Table had always been. This place was built not from ambition, but from necessity. After his father's death, Jacob had walked away from a corporate job that paid well, but left him hollow. He'd taken, out alone, found a space that smelled like mildew and regret, and spent nearly 2 years rebuilding it with his own hands. The first week, he made barely enough to cover the cost of ingredients. The first month, he had nights when no one came, at all. But slowly, the tables filled. Not because of marketing strategies or investor deals, but because people felt welcome, people felt home. And that feeling was sacred. To open the door to expansion, more locations, more staff, more responsibility, meant introducing a new kind of risk. Not financial, emotional, existential. He wasn't afraid of failing. He was afraid of succeeding at the cost of everything he had worked so hard to preserve. The decision came not in a moment of dramatic clarity, but in an act so simple, it caught him by surprise. It was Thursday afternoon, and a man walked in wearing a threadbare coat and shoes that had seen more miles than comfort. He looked lost, hungry, unsure of where to stand. Jenna was at the counter. She turned to Jacob, who nodded once. Wordlessly, they guided the man to a seat in the back and brought him a bowl of soup, bread, water. He didn't speak much, just said thank you. Jacob stood near the kitchen entrance, watching from a distance, and it struck him. Not the memory of Raymond sitting in that same spot weeks ago, not the echo of past conversations, but the undeniable realization that this was already a place of transformation, not because of any grand mission, but because of a quiet consistency in treating people with dignity. That night, Jacob called Raymond. "I'm in," he said. Raymond didn't say anything at first. Then came a breath, relieved, grateful, maybe even scared. "Are you sure?" he asked. "No," Jacob said, "but that's never stopped me before." The next few weeks moved with remarkable speed. Lawyers finalized agreements, transferring a partial stake in Miller's Table to the new trust Raymond had established. The structure was unusual but elegant. Jacob retained majority ownership and full operational control, while the expansion projects would be funded independently under a new entity, co-managed by both of them. The terms were clear. No branding. Changes, no interference with daily operations, no dilution of what the original space stood for. They began quietly. No press release, no social media announcement. Just a set of construction plans taped to the office wall, notes scribbled in marker, sketches of a second kitchen to be built in a nearby building they had leased. This new location would house a dedicated meal outreach center, free lunches distributed to anyone who needed them, no questions asked. Attached to it, a training room for basic culinary skills, resume workshops, and a small laundry and hygiene facility, staffed part-time by volunteers and local councillors. Word spread in whispers at first, among shelters, soup kitchens, caseworkers. People who had spent years navigating systems that treated their clients like statistics began to notice that something was different here. Miller's Table wasn't offering handouts. It was offering chances, real ones without condescension. The first orientation was held in the back room of the original restaurant. Jacob stood in front of 12 people, most of them hesitant, some hardened by disappointment. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't carry a clipboard. He stood with his sleeves rolled up, grease on his apron, and told them a simple story about how his own life had come apart once and how he built something, real by showing up every day and not quitting. Raymond was there too, though he stood near the back, quiet, almost blending into the walls. Jacob introduced him not as a partner or financier, but as someone who had walked through this place once, and reminded them that no one is ever just one thing. A man who had lost himself and was finding his way back not by force, but by building something that wasn't about him. By the end of that first meeting, 3 of the attendees asked to start that very week. Within a month, all 12 had gone through basic training. One of them, Clarence, a former mechanic who had lived in his car for 2 years, now worked the dish station 4 nights a week. Another Marisol with quiet hands and sharp eyes began managing pastry prep by the 2nd month. Her scones outsold everything on the menu. Jenna adapted quickly. She had always carried the soul of the place with her, and now she expanded it. Like a second heartbeat, helping design shifts, mentor the new staff and translate the quiet language of Miller's Table to people who had never felt welcome in most places. Raymond visited often but never stayed long. He came in, talked logistics, helped behind the scenes. He never tried to own the spotlight. That was never his goal. He watched from the edges, his posture still carrying the weight of someone rebuilding, brick by brick. But Jacob saw the difference in his eyes, the way he watched the people they served, the way he listened without interruption. It wasn't performance, it was presence. And slowly the place changed. Not in essence, but in purpose. The regulars still came, still sat at the same tables. The coffee still brewed at the same strength. The walls still held the same warmth. But now, alongside the comfort of tradition, there lived the quiet pulse of hope. Not the kind that shouts or demands, the kind that offers a hand and waits patiently for it to be taken. Jacob didn't talk about the partnership much. When people asked, he said they were growing, that the place had gotten bigger than him, and that was a good thing. He never mentioned the details. He didn't need to, because in the end, what mattered wasn't the legal papers or the funding model. It was the way people walked in with nothing and left feeling like someone had seen them. That was the mission. And now, that mission had room to grow. The wind carried a gentle calm through the streets of Boston that morning, brushing past traffic. Lights and brick walls weaving between early commuters and shopkeepers unlocking their doors. Inside Miller's Table, the smell of fresh bread and coffee mingled with the softer scent of lemon oil from newly polished wood. Light spilled through, the windows in long golden slants, dust floating gently in the air like the last notes of a song still lingering in the room. Jacob Miller stood behind the counter with a towel over his shoulder and a clipboard in hand, checking delivery inventories while his eyes occasionally drifted toward the window. He had been doing this every morning for years, greeting the day before it fully woke up, watching the neighborhood stretch its limbs. But now there was a quiet rhythm in the restaurant that he had never quite felt before. Not one of survival, but of purpose. A hum beneath the surface, steady and sure. 3 months had passed since he'd agreed to partner with Raymond Carter. 3 months since this place had shifted from being simply a restaurant into something larger, something that reached beyond its walls. The second facility had opened its doors quietly, just 2 streets over, offering hot meals, clean showers, and job training to anyone who stepped through. Word had spread fast, carried not by press or campaigns, but by voices that traveled from shelter to park bench to food line, voices that trusted those who had nothing to sell. Miller's Table hadn't changed in appearance. The menu still bore Jacob's careful handwriting. The servers still wore mismatched aprons. The walls still displayed the same black and white photos of the neighborhood, though now one new photo had been added, a snapshot of the new staff, arms around each other, in front of the outreach center, most of them wearing the tentative smiles of people unaccustomed to being seen. Raymond visited most mornings, sometimes with folders under his arm, sometimes with nothing but a mug of coffee and a few words. He still refused to be called a partner out loud, preferring supporter, a title that let him disappear when needed. He had grown thinner, sharper in his focus, but looser in his body, no longer wrapped so tightly in defense. When he walked into the restaurant now, the regulars nodded to him, not with suspicion, but with recognition. A man who belonged, even if no one quite knew how or why. That morning, he arrived just after 9 o'clock, wearing a soft grey sweater and holding a brown envelope. "Got a minute?" he asked Jacob. Jacob set the clipboard aside. Always. They sat at a side table near the window. Raymond placed the envelope on the table and pushed it across. "What's this?" Jacob asked, eyeing it. "Final filings," Raymond said. "Tax exemption paperwork, charitable certification, legal confirmation that the outreach program is now a fully independent non-profit. You're listed as founder and executive director." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "You're stepping back?"